the frauds and for dealing with the failed institutions. And for 15 years after the savings and loan crisis, didn't matter which party was in power, the U.S. Treasury Secretary would fly over to Tokyo and tell the Japanese, you ought to do things the way we did in the savings and loan crisis because it worked really well. Instead, you're covering up the bank losses because you don't, you say you need confidence. And so we have to lie to the people to create confidence. And it doesn't work. You will cause your recession to continue and continue, and the Japanese call it the lost decade as a result. So now we get in trouble, and what do? We adopt the Japanese approach of lying about the assets. And you know what? It's working just as well as it did in Japan.
Yeah. Are you saying that Timothy Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, and others in the administration with the banks are engaged in a cover-up to keep us from knowing what went wrong? And
Absolutely.
You are?
Absolutely. Because they are scared to death. All right? They're scared to death of a collapse. They're afraid that if they admit the truth that many of the large banks are insolvent, they think Americans are a bunch of cowards and they will run and screaming to the exits, and we won't rely on deposit insurance. And by the way, you can rely on deposit insurance. And it's foolishness. All right? Now, it may be worse than that. You can impute more cynical motives, but I think they are sincerely just panicked about we just can't let big banks fail. That's wrong.
But what might happen at this point if, in fact, they keep from us the true health of the banks?
Well, then the banks will, as they did in Japan, either stay enormously weak or Treasury will be forced to increasingly absurd giveaways of taxpayer money. We've seen how horrific AIG. Right? And remember, they kept secret from everyone what
AIG
they were doing with, Treasury. And both administrations, the Bush administration and now the Obama administration, kept secret from us what was being done with AIG. AIG was being used secretly to bail out favored banks, like UBS and like Goldman Sachs, Secretary Paulson's firm that he had come from being CEO. It got the largest amount of money, $12.9 billion, and they didn't want us to know that. And it was only congressional pressure, and not congressional pressure, by the way, on Geithner, but congressional pressure on AIG, where Congress said, we will not give you a single penny more unless we know who received the money. And when he was Treasury Secretary, Paulson created a recommendation group to tell Treasury what they ought to do with AIG, and he put Goldman Sachs on it.
Even though Goldman Sachs had a big vested stake.
Massive stake, and even though he had just been CEO of Goldman Sachs before becoming Treasury Secretary. Now, in most stages in American history, that would be a scandal of such proportions that he wouldn't be allowed in civilized society.
Like a conflict of interest, it seems.
Massive conflict.
So how did they
interest.
get away with it?
I don't know whether we've lost our capability of outrage or whether the cover-up has been so successful that people just don't have the facts to react to it.
Who's going to get the facts?
We need some chairmen or chairwomen in Congress to hold the necessary hearings. And we can blast this out. But if you leave the failed CEOs in place, it isn't just that they're terrible business people, though they are, and it isn't just that they lack integrity, though they do, because they were engaged in these frauds, but they're not going to disclose the truth about the assets.
And we have to know that in order to know what?
To know everything, to know who committed the frauds, whose bonuses we should recover, how much the assets are worth, how much they should be sold for, is the bank insolvent such that we should resolve it in this way. It's the predicate, right? You need to know the facts to make intelligent decisions, and they're deliberately leaving in place the people that cause the problem because they don't want the facts. And this is not new. The Reagan administration's central priority at all times during the savings and loan crisis was covering up the losses.
So you're saying that people in power, political power and financial power, act in concert when their own behinds are in the ringer, right?
That's right. And it's particularly a crisis that brings this out, because then the class of the bankers says, you got to keep the information away from the public or everything will collapse, right? If they understand how bad it is, they'll run for the exits.
Yeah, this week in New York at this conference, you described this as more than a financial crisis. You called it a moral crisis.
Yes.
Why?
Because it is a fundamental lack of integrity, but also because if you look back at crises, an economist who was also a presidential appointee as a regulator in the savings loan industry, right here in New York, Larry White wrote a book about the savings loan crisis, and he said, you know, one of the most interesting questions is why so few people engaged in fraud? Because objectively, you could have gotten away with it, but only about 10% of the CEOs engaged in fraud. So 90% of them were restrained by ethics and integrity. So far more than law or by FBI agents, it's our integrity that often prevents the greatest abuses. And what we had in this crisis, instead of the savings and loan, is the most elite institutions in America engaging or facilitating fraud.
This wound that you say has been inflicted on American life, the loss of workers' income and security and pensions and future, happened because of the misconduct of a relatively few very well-heeled people in very well-decorated corporate suites, right?
Right?
It was relatively a handful of people.
And their ideologies, which swept away regulation. So, in the example, regulation means that cheaters don't prosper. So instead of being bad for capitalism, it's what saves capitalism. Honest purveyors prosper is what we want. And you need regulation and law enforcement to be able to do this. The tragedy of this crisis is it didn't need to happen at all.
When you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about your work, what do you make of that? What do you tell yourself?
There's a saying that we took great comfort in. It's actually by the Dutch, who were fighting this impossible war for independence against what was then the most powerful nation in the world, Spain. And their motto was, it is not necessary to hope in order to persevere. Now, going forward, get rid of the people that have caused the problems. That's a pretty straightforward thing as well. Why would we keep CEOs and CFOs and other senior officers that had caused the problems? That's facially nuts. That's our current system. So stop that, the current system. We're hiding the losses instead of trying to find out the real losses. Stop that, because you need good information to make good decisions. Right? Follow what works instead of what's failed. Start appointing people who have records of success instead of records of failure. That would be another nice place to start. There are lots of things we can do. Even today, as late as it is, even though they've had a terrible start to the administration, they could change, and they could change within weeks. And by the way, the folks who are the better regulators, they paid their taxes, so you can get them through the vetting process a lot quicker.
William Black, thank you very much for being with me on The Journal.
Thank you so much.